Thank you. And Master Ray and Admiral Crisp, we want to welcome you to the hearing today. And we know that you've probably been listening in on the testimony earlier. We certainly appreciate the fact that we had everybody attending. And now we really look forward to hearing from you. Please proceed.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, Congressman Wilson. I very much appreciate you giving us the opportunity to lay out our view toward improving the critical mission of accounting for missing Americans from all our past conflicts. I know your time's limited, so I'd ask that the extended version of my remarks be entered for the record. Your invitation is most welcome at this time. One of the primary reasons our agency was formed in 1993 was to ensure the families of all our MIAs and the public in general received all, I repeat all, the information that the government had assembled on their cases. In my agency alone, we devote approximately 1/3 of our resources to keeping the families, the public, and the Congress fully informed. Also, as you may know, families are entitled to receive information previously classified which has had the sources and methods removed. We take this commitment very seriously, and we work hard to prove it every day. We continue to strive to provide equitable treatment to all groups representing all conflicts. Our strategy has been revised to reflect sound management and business practices and to honor the sacrifices of all of our personnel regardless of the conflict. When I meet with a group of family members, as I do virtually every month, I don't see conflicts. I see Americans who've sacrificed so much for this country and who are entitled to have that sacrifice honored and respected. There are more than 80,000 Americans missing from past conflicts. Each month, when we hold our family updates in cities and towns across the country, we see the grief and the pain that so many of our families still suffer. So long as this nation remains committed to finding its missing sons and daughters, we will continue to carry out this mission. We're looking at ways to improve how we carry out our mission, keeping the promise that this government has made to account for our missing. But in the first instance, our goal is to bring our people back alive. To be sure, our primary obligation is to bring everyone home alive from foreign battlefields. I'm sure you've seen the heroic stories of those rescued from today's conflicts. The little-known fact is that there is only one soldier missing from Iraq and none from Afghanistan. When you compare that to the 80,000 who are still missing from Vietnam, the Cold War, the Korean War, and World War II. We see this dramatic shift in response to at least two areas. The first, of course, is technology, which enables us to keep track of our own people on the battlefield and to bring them out of harm's way if need be. The second is the fact that there are lessons learned from previous conflicts applied to the combat soldiers of today. For the future, I believe we need to leverage technology more effectively, to include using information technology to communicate better with our constituents and to gather the information that is essential in resolving cases. We must avoid getting locked into fixed strategies or ways of doing business. Today's mission of accounting for the missing arose from the government's efforts during and following the Vietnam War. But although warfare has changed and technology has changed, the pain of a missing loved one has not. I see that every day as I interact with our families. The effort to account for the missing from all conflicts is one promise that I will never abandon. In order to effectively serve our constituents, we must constantly evaluate and assess our methods of operations, resource bases, and command relationships to ensure they are doing what must be done if we're to continue to be successful. While we must continue to honor the sacrifices of our heroes of past conflicts, we must also keep our eyes on both the present and the future. We owe a debt to those currently serving and to those who will serve in the future to do all we can to assure them that we will keep the promise. We need to encourage out-of-the-box thinking on this issue. And while we shouldn't reject tradition just for the sake of doing things differently, neither should we allow tradition to become a straitjacket to innovation. I've touched, I know, on several issues directed at our future efforts and our future commitments, and I will be more than happy to take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Admiral Crisp.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to appear before you, and I'm pleased to update you on the Joint Prisoner of War Missing Action Accounting Command after my first year as commander and following the last appearance 9 months ago. First, on behalf of the men and women of JPAC, I want to express my sincere appreciation for your continued support for personnel accounting efforts. You heard from family members, veterans, and concerned citizens in the first panel, each from very diverse backgrounds and perspectives. All are important to us, and we listen to their recommendations, and we appreciate their support to our humanitarian mission. Delegation visits like Ms. Admiral's Griffiths and those of veteran service organizations serve to reinforce the United States government's commitment to the POW-MIA mission and demonstrate the importance of our issue to the families of those who remain unaccounted for, as well as the veterans who served with these men. In addition to our field operations, much of my focus in JPAC has been on to structure it to effectively accomplish our mission and to provide a quality of work environment for the men and women of JPAC, and to establish processes that will sustain and improve the organization and mission in the future. In 2008, we worked in 15 countries and completed 72 missions. We identified 80 Americans who lost their lives in the service to our nation. This is a 14% increase over the 2004-2007 identification average. This year, we're working in 12 countries, conducting 62 missions to account for missing for World War II, the Korean War, Vietnam, and have already identified 29 individuals. In addition to continuing our operational focus, we have also concentrated on process improvements both in our partnerships with foreign countries as well as internal to JPAC. We conducted a 20-year assessment with the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. We have also realized very positive progress with the Laos People Democratic Republic in how we conduct our joint field activities, enabling us to save money and maximize the team's time on sites. The Kingdom of Cambodia continues to be extremely supportive of our humanitarian mission, and we also receive support from the Republic of Korea, Papua New Guinea, the Republic of India, the People's Republic of China, and many other countries throughout the world. In the area of JPAC improvements, recruiting and retention of our scientific staff has been my focus for the past year. We have implemented several programs: student loan repayment, creation of developmental positions leading to senior positions, the establishing of a forensic science academy, to name a few. We are already realizing results from these initiatives. Federal employment in the laboratory is 78%, with 15 full-time fellows. That brings the laboratory numbers to 110% of our workload requirement. Our scientists continue to excel in research and development of innovative forensic identification tools and techniques. Over the past 2 years, our focus has been on video superimposition and radiographic clavicle bone matching. Once validated and accepted in the forensic science community, our identification rates should increase. This new identification technique is going to make a significant capability applicable to the Korean War unknowns. Since my last opportunity to speak with you, we have more than doubled our total laboratory analytical space. When I departed Hawaii last week, the remains of more than 80 American service members were under analysis. This is almost twice the number that were under analysis at this time last year. By this summer, I expect 50 to 60 more remains unilaterally turned over by the North Koreans in the early 90s, and often referred to as K208, to be completely moved to the facility at Pearl Harbor. This will more than triple the analytical table space, and for the first time in 19 years, the scientists will be able to analyze these remains in detail without interruption of other cases. We are quite pleased with the additional space, and we look forward to the completion of our military project, our military construction project, when our entire organization will be in the same location, and that will increase capabilities and effectiveness at JPAC. This is a brief update on JPAC, and we believe we are poised for the future. We are in the right location. We have the full support of the United States Pacific Command and the Defense Prisoner of War Missing Personnel Office. Madam Chair and members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity, and I await your questions.
Thank you very much. And of course, we're here today to try and see how we move forward, recognizing the gains that have been made and some of the difficulties in trying to bring together so many interests when it comes to the issue that we're dealing with, which we know is just so terribly important, I think, to our country. I'm wondering, Ambassador Ray, going back to the structure question that we talked about in the earlier panel, will the study by IDA assess the POWMIA community organizational structure to see if changes, in fact, do need to be made?
Madam Chairman, the IDA study is focused on how to improve the rate of identifications, referring to comments made by Congressman Wilson in his remarks. We've recognized that we do need to look at increasing the rate, given the circumstances of the conflicts, the Vietnam War. Sites are deteriorating at a remarkably accelerating rate. World War II, those family members that we're aware of are getting no younger day by day. And so we owe it to them, as well as to honoring those who've sacrificed for the country, to do all that we can to increase the pace. What we don't have a very firm handle on at the moment is to what level should we, or to what level can we increase this. We are currently doing some 70 per year. The study initially focused on a number of 180 per year. That is subject to modification as we look at what's feasible, and it's looking at the entire identification process. It's too easy, or I should say it's rather the view that if we make a change in the lab that we will materially affect the identification process, ignores the fact that there are other elements that play into it. If you increase the numbers, for example, of bone cuttings in the lab of remains for IDs, you also have to consider the impact on the workload of the Armed Forces DNA Identification Lab. You also have to consider how much research support, how much analytical support has to go into working with that anthropologist to make that ID. Mm-hmm. So what the firm that's doing the study has been directed to do is look at the entire process, look at what is feasible.
Are they also focusing on the structure?
They are focusing on the structure, the funding, and the manning of the lab and other aspects of the identification procedure to see how we can achieve increases.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you have some thoughts as well, though, in creating more of a defense field agency?
I constantly look at how we're organized, and of course one of the ideas that I have given to people to look at would be, is it more effective to have a defense agency concept as opposed to having a geographic commander responsible? I'm not wedded to one way or another. What I have asked people to do is to look at the various configurations that are possible and try and decide what is the most effective way, not only to do the mission that we currently have, which is to account for the missing from the wars of the past, but to configure ourselves, to position ourselves so that we can effectively serve the nation for current and future wars.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And just turning to Admiral Crisp, before my time is up, do you think a more direct funding stream would help JPAC receive the required resources that it needs?
Right now, the funding stream is called out in the budget. So for that, I think we have the visibility. I believe that the U.S. Pacific Command supports the funding for JPAC. The only reason we had a reduction this year was a congressionally mandated mark. And so I am comfortable that we have visibility of what we're doing at JPAC for our funds.
Okay, thank you. My time is up, and I'll move to Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank both of you for your obviously dedicated service. It's been inspiring to me to hear both of you speak. Additionally, Ambassador Ray, I want to reiterate my appreciation for your military service, your extraordinary diplomatic service, and wish you well on your return to the State Department. And this is really a question for each of you. And the different VSOs that we heard from, their commitment was also inspiring, and that's what creates this question. We've heard some testimony that contracting for professional historians, archivists, genealogists, and researchers could assist both DPMO and JPAC in carrying out current missions. Given that JPAC is only 84% manned at this date, to what extent has the use of contractors been evaluated to increase JPAC's ability to meet mission requirements and help reduce the backlog of remains that must be identified?
The contracts that we use, I have contracted forensic anthropologists. I have coming on board this summer, a contracted odontologist. For the area of historian, I am taking the command from 4 historians to 8 this year. And so I am using the mill to sieve conversion when we're talking about the numbers in that to shape the numbers of historians that we need to get the job done.
In regards to DPMO, part of the decision on how we allocate analysts and researchers will depend on the final decisions on the conflict strategy, which is, as you heard in the earlier testimony, has been put in draft and is available for review. We have made some changes, in fact, in the allocation of researchers to various conflicts to ensure a little more equitable coverage. I wouldn't go so far as to say that we've achieved all the goals that we set for ourselves. We were fortunate last year in working within the defense system to get some authorized increases in personnel. Of course, my first priority, because I do also have to manage the flow of information to families, was to increase the staffing available to man that function, and that is the declassification process to ensure that we comply with the intent of the regulation, that those documents relating to POW/MIA cases that are classified are declassified and placed in a place that they are accessible not only to the families but to the public. We are working now to increase our staff in that area as well.
And both of you have identified advances in technology, the clavicle identification. I am somewhat surprised not to hear about DNA capabilities of technological.
I could tell you about what AFGL was doing. It was their demineralization process. So it was when the Korean War men came back and were buried in the punch bowl and exhumed, they found that they had the mortuary in Japan had soaked the remains in formaldehyde and put a formaldehyde paste over it. So that challenge of not having DNA has put AFGL on a cutting edge of trying to find ways of finding DNA in different ways. That said, the demineralization process, which they did just several years ago, impacted the entire forensic capability of the United States. The difference being, instead of having to have a piece of bone half the size of the palm of your hand, now you only have to have a piece the size of your fingernail. And that made a tremendous difference for the remains from Vietnam, because the soil deteriorates them so much. In many cases, at that point in time, the pieces of bone we couldn't get DNA out of, now we can. So you will see that making a difference there. I know that AFDIL is working on not only advances for their mitochondrial DNA, but also their paternal DNA, and again, advancing their demineralization process. If you'd like me to talk about the advancements in JPAC on the clavicle bones, I'd be happy to talk about that. It's pretty fantastic.
I'd be interested.
Basically, if you look at how forensic anthropologists have in the past looked at it, they take a clavicle bone and they try to match a few places, trying to guess who that person could be. I have brought a young scientist on board, a PhD in forensic anthropology, who had the idea of doing clavicle bones with the lower neck and doing 8 different bones with 30 different points of identification. And he has worked industriously on this for a year, and we're up to the point where he has identified 9 of 10 correctly. Okay, so he's excited, I'm excited, and so we started out on this journey. The first thing you had to have were the x-rays of the men who died, and there are unknowns. So we've been working to get the x-rays. We got them from the Army and the Air Force. We just recently found the Navy and Marine Corps. And basically you have to go through entire spools of every x-ray that was done at a hospital to find that one person you want. So we're working on it, but we're getting all the x-rays in. I had one photographer working on it. I now have a team of 4 photographers capturing these x-rays digitally. After that is done, and they're doing that on 2 shifts right now, after that is done, instead of having a PhD outline the bones on the x-ray, I'm going to look to see maybe a draftsman or a master's level person to work on that so that we can accelerate that. So it started out with a process that would take 4 years. We have now shrunk it to 2 years, and I am trying very hard to try to compress it to 1 year by watching how they do their work, keep adding extra things they think they'll make them go faster, because I think when we're done, we will have, assuming that it's accepted by the forensic science community, we will have a fabulous identification process. The entire, there's scientists all over the world that are aware of what we're doing because they come and drop by. They want to just sit and watch what we're doing because it's so cutting edge. So I'm very excited about it.
Excellent.
Thank you. Dr. Steiner?
Just wondered, there was references made to this, to your school. Would you talk about that, please?
Forensic Science Academy started out as I began to look, and our whole team began to look at recruiting and retention for JPAC. There was a variety of reasons, and I can discuss them later, why the manning was going down. But one of the things that I noticed is that we had talent in the command, but they needed to go to that extra level in order to be a PhD level candidate. They needed extra training. In addition to that, many of the PhDs that work for us would love to be associate professors at universities. By putting together an academy that not only self-trained the people you needed to pull them up by their bootstraps, you were also giving your own PhDs the opportunity to earn associate professor credit. We've taken that further by working with the University of Hawaii, who has a PhD program in anthropology, and we continue to link with other medical universities worldwide to build this into a fantastic training and recruiting and retention tool.
Why don't you talk about the manning issues, since they're related?
The manning, when I first started looking at it, was only at forensic anthropologists that were deployable. So much of the information that you asked from me was just focused on those deployable anthropologists. But as we got involved going back and forth between your committee and myself, we got into the whole lab. So let me just go through the entire laboratory. The laboratory is authorized 46 people, and they have 36 assigned. Those are federal employees. There are 15 fellows. A fellow can either be a PhD or a master's level person. So when you get done, you had 51 work years against 46 authorization. That's 110% manning. Keep in mind, from my perspective, to have a robust command, any function, you should have federal employees. You should never rely on mission-critical execution in augmented manpower. Okay, so the whole focus that I'm doing this year and into the following year is to bring aboard federal employees. That said, if you looked at just the anthropologists, we have 26 anthropologists that are authorized. We have 18 that are assigned. 10 of those fellows are anthropologists. So that means I have 28 anthropologists for an authorization of 26. Okay? If you go into just deployable, which is what so many people look at, I have 22 deployable anthropologists, 14 assigned, 4 fellows for 18. That's the critical area I'm looking at because it's 64% for federal and 81% with the fellows. That said, if you compare that to the Army manpower study that was done that required 27 anthropologists, our 26 is very close. In addition to that, we mitigate that by archaeologists, because many times when you go out on burials, what you're really looking for is a change in the soil composition. And so the archaeologists take up that load. So if you look at the entire manpower study that was done by the Army, with a requirement of 37 and JPAC having 46, I think we're in good stead, but not satisfied with that. I asked the Pacific Command to hire someone, and they're bringing in an Air Force team of manpower and industrial engineers, and they start this month. And they will go all the way to September, and we're going to do a complete requirements document for the command. And that will include, first, it gives you the quality and quantity that you need to do the job you're currently assigned to do. And it'll also allow us to say, if we were to increase identifications, or if we were to increase recoveries, what would that manpower skill set be? And so that's what will be ready and available come the end of this year.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Shea Porter?
Thank you. Thank you both for being here and for the work that you do. Very difficult, sensitive work, and many people are depending on you, so thank you. Mr. Ray, I had a question about what kind of relationship your organization has with the family members, listening to those who lost loved ones in Vietnam versus those who lost loved ones in World War II or Korea or other wars. And could you talk a little bit about some of the problems that you're encountering and some of the solutions you think might be there?
Well, I would say that our relations with the family members as an organization, and we meet with them 8 times a year in cities around the country at family updates, and twice a year in Washington, one for the Vietnam War and one for the Korea-Cold War, although this year, because of economics, we will be doing our Washington meeting in St. Louis. But what I see, and I go to almost all of these, or as many as I can, and I try to talk with every family member that attends. I don't really see an appreciable difference in how we interact with the family based on the conflict. Each case is an individual case. Each family is handled individually. And what I have observed is that the interaction is based more on the circumstances of the individual loss than on the conflict that it occurred in. We have, in the time since we've been organized, and our family updates reached out to over 14,000 people. We just recently, last weekend, in fact, did one here in Bethesda, Maryland. We had 122 family members attending. Over 70 of those, by the way, were first-time attendees. And over, I want to say 60% of the attendees were Korea, Cold War. but as you walked around the room and talked to people, unless they told you what war their relative was missing in, you couldn't tell.
Shared sacrifice. And you said that you're going to provide transparency and community efforts as part of your strategy.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
what will be different?
Well, when I took this job in September 2006, the strategy was most current conflict. And on the surface, that sounds like it maybe makes sense, but then when you start to think about it, there are similarities in conflicts when you talk, for example, about the danger and loss of sites and the danger that you're losing witnesses. Losing witnesses is far more critical problem in World War II than it would be in a more current conflict. I also ask myself, what do we do when the current conflict becomes the most recent conflict, the most recent historic conflict, when this war is over? How do we reapportion resources if we're going to talk about most recent conflict? And even though we only have a very small number of cases that might still be unaccounted for at the end of this conflict, the circumstances will make it very labor-intensive. We will be dealing with hostile populations. We will be dealing with a much more complex issue than we do in many of the other theaters that we have to work in. I doubt very seriously if we have very good relations with former foes for some of the other conflicts. I don't see that being the case in a conflict in the Middle East. So that caused me to start questioning whether most current conflict was actually a viable strategy, or perhaps we should be looking at it more in terms of look at all the conflicts and then look at those cases that are in most danger of us losing if we don't do something, and then evaluate them across all
Keeping
conflicts.
resources available. And if I have one more second, Admiral Crisp, I know that the personnel who work with you have extreme challenges in the actual physical setting where they go. I remember hearing about this last year. How's the morale, and how are things going in terms of the physical risks that they undertake in order to go to these sites to recover our beloved servicemen and women who have died?
Well, I think the morale is great. I just had a report from the Indian officials that came back from the mission in Arunachal Pradesh, and they talked about our men basically climbing on their hands and knees as they went over very steep areas to make it through the jungle. So the sites in India are at extreme elevations. So they are working hard. They are in arduous situations. I do prepare them. For instance, if they're going into high altitude mountaineering kinds of recoveries, I make sure that they maintain a higher level of physical fitness in order to accomplish those missions and not be harmed.
I thank them. I thank both of you and the families.
Ma'am, if I might
Service.
add one thing, please, and I think Admiral Crisp is being overly modest when she describes what her people do. Like her, I go out and visit these people in the field when they're on excavation sites, and actually have been doing it even before this job when I was Consul General in Ho Chi Minh City and Ambassador in Cambodia. And I am impressed with the morale and dedication of the people in the field. But I would go so far as to say that in her modesty, she did not mention that even in Hawaii, they face risks. She was talking about the X-ray project, for example. These are old X-rays that emit toxic fumes when used, and she has people who are risking their health in order to settle these cases, and I think that is a fact that should be noted, and they're to be applauded for the risks they take to pursue this mission.
And we certainly thank them. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, and I certainly hope we're doing everything we can to mitigate those health risks as well. And please let us know if there is something else that we should be doing. Ms. Gilroy?
Madam Chair, and thank you for allowing me to participate. I've learned a great deal from both of the panels that have presented here this afternoon. And thank you, Ambassador and Admiral, for participating. Admiral, you referred to the rigors of the recoveries in our Arunachal province, and I appreciate you bringing that up. As you know, I had sent you a letter regarding the recovery of the remains of Second Lieutenant John Funk, a resident of Madison County, who's as a navigator aboard C-87 aircraft disappeared. And they have been located by Mr. Clayton Cools, a private citizen outside a village in that province. And as we know, time is a very valuable and limited commodity for each and every one of us. But for the families of these men, the days are getting shorter. Lieutenant Funk's radio operator was also one of the 5 whose remains were uncovered. His wife is still alive, but she is 93 years old. And I think it's imperative that we make the recovery of remains of our World War II fallen aviators and others a priority.
I agree with you. I mean, I have a widow that's in a mission just on the hill right from where I was at, in her 90s, that emails me, very concerned to have her husband back with her before she goes on. So we're working very hard. In the case of people that go and find sites, and in the case of Mr. Cools, we have asked for the information and documentation. So very, very important to us when people go out, and there are many groups that go out and find things, that they return to us very detailed reports of what they have seen. Normally, we would prefer to wait till we had the documented information before we would ever go to a family member to say we were looking at going somewhere for their loved one. So in the case of Mr. Cools, we have asked for all the documentation, and we hope to get it all.
Thank you.
And the government of India is very forward-leaning in helping us, and so I look forward
That's
to a
good
long partnership.
In terms of the overall issue and reassessment of how resources should be deployed, in 2006, the Department of Defense stated that, quote, "Our long-term strategy for addressing World War II accounting is very much a work in progress," and noted that Congress mandated that the department make a reasonable effort to recover remains of U.S. servicemen lost in Pacific Theater air operations, particularly in New Guinea, that it contemplated a limited effort. Besides some physical challenges, like you described with the altitude and other issues, what is holding back, or why? What can we do to help you to complete this particular mission? Or not? I don't mean necessarily
talking
Lieutenant Funk. I mean the mission of recovery of the World War II missing.
I believe we're focused on getting out to these sites and making positive relationships with all the countries, and that is the most important thing. If you desire to increase the number of missions, then that would be something that I would work into the calculus of what manpower would be required to do that. But right now, if I were to look at level of effort in World War II, I spend 21% of my recovery and investigation missions in World War II, 12.8% in Korea, and 65.8% in the Vietnam War. So that is how I have parceled out doing the recovery and investigation teams.
Would outsourcing, I think it was the variations of this question been asked earlier, but, and I heard you talk about how important the mission critical items were, but certainly there are some private labs and others that could be used to augment some of the department's efforts.
If I were to speak on behalf of my scientists, they would tell you that when you go out and have someone else disturb a site, many times you can destroy that very important piece of information that would have made the difference in being able to identify that hero or not. So on their behalf, they would say that they need to have very structured, stringent rules and regulations, and the identifications need to be done in a scientific laboratory, and they would most likely say contracting out would lead to error rates that our families would find unacceptable, if that's what you're asking me.
Thank you. My time's expired. Thank you very much for your answers.
Thank you very much, and I just wanted to let you know, Ms. Gilbride, we really appreciate your being here today and sharing your interest in this issue. Thank you. Before I ask a question, I'm going to go to Mr. Wilson, and then we'll come back, and then we're going to stop the hearing in just a few minutes. Mr. Wilson.
And Admiral, I'm particularly happy to hear of the cooperation with the government of India, which is now a very strong strategic ally of the United States. And in particular, my father flew the hump. And so he served with the 14th Air Force Flying Tigers in India and China. So as you were reviewing that, it had special interest to me. My final question for each of you, would a congressional mandate a new law that DOD must ensure the fullest possible accounting of the missing and prisoners of war from Korea and World War II be helpful in addressing some of your concerns?
Congressman Wilson, Madam Chairwoman, any congressional authorization that we get, a congressional mandate is most helpful to us, particularly as we try to gather the resources needed to do any extra missions. So if there is a clear congressional mandate, it is always helpful.
And I will yield to Ambassador Ray on that, since it's clearly a policy area.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would note that in the 2004 Defense Authorization Act, really they reiterated the sense of Congress that the U.S. should continue to be relentless in those POW/MIA efforts. And I'm wondering, Ambassador Ray, when it comes to trying to delineate perhaps a new direction or strategy that you spoke to earlier, do you see that in need of legislative action at all?
At this point, ma'am, what we are trying to do, I'm trying to get as much input as I can from those in the community. And the community, I might point out, is, although we're the two large gorillas in the zoo, it's a fairly large menagerie of people who have an equity in it, who have a role to play in it, and whose input I'd like to assess before we try and shape the strategy. At this point, I don't know that the remedies needed are legislative and not administrative changes in how we do it.
Do you have the flexibility that you need to adjust that as you see fit?
I have been given fairly free rein to try and herd the bureaucracy in the direction it needs to go.
Okay, thank you. I certainly acknowledge and recognize it, that many people who care so deeply in this issue are coming at it from different perspectives, and it's very difficult sometimes to blend all of those together in a way that works for everybody. Looking at the need to find family reference samples and how difficult that is, I wonder if you could just turn to the issue of where at this time, as I understand it, we allow the service casualty offices to assist in seeking those samples, family reference samples for identification. Do you see that JPAC could play a larger role in this? I guess this is really to you, Admiral.
Well, what we're doing.
What do you see as some of the issues surrounding that question?
Family reference sample issue was primarily an ability to surge in genealogical research. So I know that the Joint Staff and others, we have basically a process improvement working group, which would be Joint Staff, OSD, AFDIL, JPAC. There is a need for a surge in genealogical work. So if you were to look at right now, 64% of the we have on hand 64% of the family reference samples, and we need the rest. It's around 3,000, and most of them are in the Korean War area, and so we do need that to be surged. In addition to that, we are looking at scrubbing the data. Each group has a different language that they use to account for their numbers. So very important in any common operating picture is to standardize the language. That needs to be done this year. Ambassador Ray and I are proposing putting together a working group of just the people who do the numbers, to sit them down in one room and scrub that information. And then after we get the common operating picture in paper, then our recommendation would be to automate that with some kind of middleware that goes into the legacy software so that everyone can see what the other person is seeing with family reference samples.
Is there an area in which JPAC should have a larger role in this?
We work on it in a process improvement group, so I don't see it as a larger role. I think the stumbling block was infusing the services with more money for their genealogical work.
And I might add, Madam Chairwoman, the Joint Staff recently conducted a study regarding this issue and is looking for ways that they can be helpful. It's really less a matter of asking, can this or that organization do more, but how can we all do the job so that that the whole job gets done better? And as Admiral Crisp alluded to, one of the biggest problems with this issue and with many other defense issues is every service has its own language. Every organization we deal with has its own language. I spent the first year on the job having people interpret for me when at staff meetings because I didn't understand most of what was being said coming from state. So we've spent a lot of time just trying to make sure that, in fact, the problem is a problem and not a matter of we're simply saying the same thing in different ways and leading us to the conclusion that there is.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly appreciate that. It was mentioned that we were here about 9 months ago, and I'm pleased that I had a chance to visit with you at Admiral as well in Hawaii at JPAC. And what I'm wondering is, where should we be next year? What would you like to see have changed in the interim, and what questions would you hope we might ask next year?
Well, definitely I'd like to have my addition finished this summer so I could have already tripled the amount of table space and seeing what positive results come from being able to lay out for the first time those unknowns from the Korean War that came in the 90s. So that's been a long time coming to have that opportunity, and I would look forward to some kind of results from that effort.
I think the ideal situation, in my view, would be that we determine an increased pace of output, be that identifications or recoveries, find ways to achieve it, and discover next year that we need to do more.
All right. Thank you very much. We certainly appreciate your being here. Again, thank you to our first panel as well. We know that you've traveled to be here, and I think that everybody who sits on this panel has a very clear sense of your commitment, and it's quite inspiring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Another great hearing.
Ms. Kilroy, it was great meeting you, and
Yeah, I know. Sure.